America's debt isn't just a big number that lives in Washington. It's a pressure system that eventually moves through everything real: jobs, housing, state budgets, and the cost of simply living. When federal debt pushes into the high $30 trillion range and interest costs climb toward $1 trillion a year, you're no longer talking about accounting. You're talking about a tightening vice because interest is different from every other line item. You can't reform it with a speech. You can't wish it away with optimism. It's contractual. It compounds. And when rates stay higher for longer, interest becomes the quiet tax that crowds out everything else. That's the first point most people miss. The federal debt story doesn't stay federal. It bleeds into the states through three channels. First, federal pullback. When the federal government is squeezed, it starts looking for cuts or cost shifts. Some of that lands on states through reduced grants, slower reimbursements, tighter program rules, or more unfunded mandates. The headlines will argue politics. The states will feel cash flow. Second, financing conditions. States, cities, and public agencies live on borrowing too. Higher interest rates don't just raise your mortgage, they raise the cost to build roads, maintain water systems, keep transit running, and refinance older debt. When debt service climbs, budgets get eaten from the inside. Third, recession math. States are required to balance budgets. The federal government can deficit spend through downturns. States cannot. When a recession hits, state tax revenues fall fast. Income taxes, sales taxes, real estate transfer taxes, corporate taxes, all of it. And at the exact same time, demand for services rises. Unemployment support, housing assistance, healthcare spending, policing, courts, emergency aid. So the real question isn't, is America in trouble? The question is, which states are structurally built to absorb a shock, and which ones are built like glass, beautiful in good light, brittle under pressure? Because beneath the GDP headlines, there are fault lines: housing markets propped up by leverage, industries concentrated in a few employers, shrinking populations that hollow out the tax base, pension promises that quietly pile up, and climate-related costs that keep rising even when everything else is falling. This is not a doomsday prophecy. It's a stress test. And if you understand the mechanics, you'll stop being surprised by outcomes that look sudden but were actually built over years. So let's walk through 15 states that are especially exposed if the next major downturn hits. While debt, inflation, aftershocks, and high borrowing costs are still in the system. Not because these places are bad. Some are powerhouses. But powerhouses can still be fragile when the pillars holding them up are narrow. Number 15, Washington. Washington sells an image of modern prosperity, tech campuses, global brands, high incomes, gleaming neighborhoods. The hidden risk is concentration. When your growth is anchored to a handful of dominant employers and a handful of dominant sectors, you don't need a collapse to get hurt. You just need a synchronized pullback. When tech slows, it doesn't just mean fewer perks. It means fewer contractors, fewer support jobs, fewer startup dollars, fewer commercial leases, fewer restaurant receipts, fewer home buyers who can qualify at today's rates. The shock doesn't arrive like a movie explosion. It arrives as a chain reaction, softening demand, then layoffs, then lower spending, then fiscal stress. Washington also carries a second vulnerability: the cost structure. When housing, childcare, and basic living costs rise faster than the psychological ability of households to absorb them, you create a brittle middle class. People who look fine on paper but are one job disruption away from falling into delinquency. The state can look wealthy while families are living with no margin. Add a tax structure that leans heavily on consumption and property related activity, and you get a budget that can feel strong until spending slows. In a recession, spending always slows. That's the point of a recession. Number 14, Alaska. Alaska is the clearest example of an economy that can be rich and still be vulnerable, not because of scarcity, but because of dependence. When a state leans heavily on one primary revenue engine, energy, everything else becomes secondary. And when energy prices swing, the whole system swings with it. Alaska also has the logistical burden most Americans never feel. Distance makes everything expensive. Energy for heating, the cost to ship food, the cost to build and maintain infrastructure across huge territory. Those costs don't go away in a downturn. They become heavier relative to incomes. Then there's population. A state losing working age residents doesn't just lose people, it loses future tax receipts, employers, housing demand, and the next generation of skilled labor. When a recession hits a shrinking state, recovery becomes harder because the rebound has fewer people to carry it. Number 13, Louisiana. Louisiana sits on productive assets, ports, energy, industry, culture. But its risk profile is a brutal combination. High poverty, reliance on cyclical industries, and recurring disaster costs. A state can endure economic volatility, or it can endure repeated physical shocks. Enduring both at the same time is where systems break. Major storms aren't just weather events, they are balance sheet events. They raise insurance costs, they scare off investment, they destroy housing stock, and they force government spending when revenues are already weak. Louisiana's long-term danger isn't just a bad year. It's the slow stacking of liabilities, infrastructure repair, insurance market instability, and an economy that can struggle to diversify fast enough if the energy cycle turns downward. Number 12, Arizona. Arizona's exposure is the collision of rapid growth with resource constraint. Growth feels like strength. More residents, more construction, more retail, more tax base. But growth built on cheap credit and endless expansion becomes fragile when rates rise and essentials tighten. Housing affordability is one pressure point, but water is the deeper one. The Southwest isn't negotiating with opinions, it's negotiating with hydrology. Colorado River. Uncertainty and long-term allocation politics are not abstract. They affect agriculture, development plans, and the long-run confidence of homeowners and businesses. When a state's growth story depends on constant inward migration and constant construction, a recession hits twice. Fewer people arrive, and fewer projects get financed. The state can go from boom to hangover quickly. Number 11, New Jersey. New Jersey's risk isn't that it lacks wealth. It's that it carries heavy obligations and high costs in a world where mobile workers and mobile companies can choose lower burden alternatives. When property taxes are high, and living costs are high, and long-term liabilities are high, you don't have much room for error. A downturn reduces revenue while fixed obligations remain fixed. Pension commitments don't shrink because the economy is having a bad year. Debt service doesn't negotiate. This is where the difference between income and financial flexibility matters. A state can have high incomes and still be boxed in if too much of its cash flow is already spoken for. Number 10, Indiana. Indiana's vulnerability is classic. Heavy manufacturing exposure in a world where demand can drop fast. Manufacturing states don't experience recessions as a mild inconvenience. They experience them as a reduction in orders, sudden, sharp, and contagious. When factories slow, it's not only the factory, jobs, it's the suppliers, the logistics, the local diners, the small dealerships, the landlords. Manufacturing is a multiplier. That's why it creates prosperity in good times and why it creates pain in downturns. The second stress is household affordability. Even in cheaper states, when wages lag behind the post 2020 cost resets, food, insurance, utilities, households lose resilience. And resilience is what prevents a slowdown from becoming a personal crisis. Number 9, Texas. Texas has real strengths: scale, business formation, job creation, energy capacity, inward migration. The risk is the very thing it markets: speed. Fast growth strains infrastructure. Fast growth inflates housing. Fast growth increases exposure to boom-bust cycles in real estate and credit. Texas is also a three-engine state: energy, tech, and property development. If all three cool at the same time, oil price weakness, tech layoffs, housing slowdown, confidence changes fast. And once confidence changes, you see it in the usual places. Listings rise, construction pauses, consumer spending softens, layoffs accelerate, and state and local budgets get squeezed. When a high growth state slows, it doesn't feel like stable decline. It feels like the air leaving a balloon. Number 8, Nevada. Nevada is what happens when an economy is tied to discretionary spending. Tourism heavy states are great when the consumer is strong and credit is easy. They are brutally exposed when the consumer pulls back. This is not theory. Nevada has already shown how fast unemployment can spike when travel and entertainment freeze. The vulnerability is structural. When visitors don't come, wages drop, tips drop, sales taxes drop, and state revenues drop. And because the public sector depends heavily on consumption-linked revenue, the state's ability to cushion the downturn is limited right when citizens need it most. Number 7, Hawaii. Hawaii shares the tourism dependence problem, but with additional constraints: geographic isolation and extreme cost of living. When travel demand weakens, Hawaii doesn't just lose extra money. It loses the core engine that supports many jobs and much of the state's revenue. At the same time, residents face some of the most punishing housing and grocery costs in the nation. That means the local population has less buffer. In a recession, people who already have no margin don't adjust. They leave, and outmigration becomes a long-run drag on recovery. Number 6, New York. New York is exposed because it sits on top of high-income tax flows tied to finance and corporate profits. When markets slide and bonuses shrink, the revenue hit can be immediate. In a recession, even a small decline at the top can create a large hole because so much tax capacity is concentrated in a smaller slice of earners. Add commercial real estate weakness, office demand shifts, falling valuations, stress on the property tax base, and you get a state and city budget problem that can deepen fast. New York City's own reporting has highlighted elevated office availability relative to pre-pandemic levels, and that matters because property taxes are the oxygen of city government. New York's strength is also its risk. It is connected to global finance. When global finance catches a cold, New York sneezes first. Number 5, Delaware. Delaware is small, but financially important because it relies heavily on corporate registrations and related fees. The vulnerability is that this is a revenue stream tied to business conditions and legal structures more than it is tied to diversified local production. In a broad downturn, corporate activity can slow, restructurings can rise, and the revenue Delaware depends on can become less predictable. Small states with concentrated revenue sources can move from surplus to deficit faster than people expect because they don't have a wide tax base to stabilize swings. Number 4, Maryland. Maryland looks strong because of high incomes and proximity to Washington. But that closeness is also a dependency. Federal spending, federal contracts, and federal employment are a major pillar. If the federal government enters a period of budget tightening, or even just hiring freezes and contract reductions, Maryland feels it. And because so much of its prosperity is clustered, the shock can be uneven. Some counties stay fine while others soften quickly. Then add housing affordability pressures around the DC metro, and you get a state where high incomes can still be paired with high fragility, especially for middle-class households who bought at peak prices and are now paying peak carrying costs. Number 3, Illinois. Illinois is the clearest balance sheet risk on this list. It isn't about one industry. It's about long-term obligations. When pension liabilities are large and funding gaps are persistent, the state has less flexibility in downturns. That is, not ideology, it's math. The bigger the fixed commitments, the less room there is to respond when revenues fall. Multiple analyses continue to rank Illinois among the states with the heaviest unfunded pension burdens, and that becomes a compounding stressor when borrowing costs are high and growth is weaker. Illinois also faces the classic second-order effect, outmigration. When people and businesses leave, the remaining tax base must shoulder a larger share of obligations. That creates a feedback loop. Higher burdens accelerate departures, which increases burdens again. Number 2, California. California is a case study in how a giant economy can still be fragile if revenue and wealth are concentrated and costs are extreme. California relies heavily on income taxes, and a meaningful share of those receipts come from high earners whose incomes are tied to capital gains, equity compensation, and the performance of tech and markets. When those sources decline, budget gaps can open quickly. California also sits on significant real estate exposure and acute insurance pressure. Housing markets don't need to crash to cause damage. They just need to freeze. When affordability is stretched and rates stay elevated, transaction volumes drop. That reduces related tax revenues and slows the wealth effect spending that supports many local businesses. Commercial real estate stress is another visible crack, especially in San Francisco, where office vacancy surged to record levels in the post-pandemic era. sfstandard.com layer on homelessness pressures, climate and water constraints, and net domestic outmigration, and you get a state that can look unstoppable until several stressors align at once. Number 1, Florida. Florida is the most exposed, not because it lacks growth, but because its growth model is tied to the most recession-sensitive and climate-sensitive combination in America. Tourism, construction, and real estate, all under rising insurance and disaster costs. Florida's insurance market is not a side story. It's a structural issue. When non-renewals rise and premiums climb, the cost of owning property changes. That changes migration. That changes affordability. That changes the willingness of retirees and middle-class families to anchor their lives there. Florida has been identified as leading the nation in homeowners insurance non-renewal rate increases over recent years, a signal of the stress running through the system. Now combine that with a recession. Tourism pulls back, construction slows, home sales stall, And when the housing engine stalls in a state where so much economic activity is connected to growth and property demand, the slowdown spreads quickly. Add the long run threat, coastal exposure, and rising disaster losses. You can't build a stable middle class economy on ever rising carrying costs for shelter. Eventually, the math turns. So, what should you take from this? First, stop thinking of national debt as politics. Think of it as gravity. As the debt stock grows and interest costs rise, policy flexibility shrinks. The federal government has less room to absorb shocks without consequences. Second, understand what makes a state fragile. It's not whether it's red or blue. It's not whether it's rich. It's concentration, leverage, fixed obligations, and sensitivity to cycles. Housing, tourism, finance, energy, and disaster costs. Third, watch the leading indicators that matter in real life. Unemployment claims, housing inventory and transaction volume, commercial vacancy rates, insurance availability, state budget revisions, and municipal bond spreads. Those are the instruments that tell you whether stress is turning into breakage. And finally, if you're a man building a household, building stability, building a future, this is the mindset. You don't need panic, but you do need margin. Margin in your finances, margin in your skills, margin in your options. Because the next downturn won't announce itself politely. It will show up as higher costs, fewer opportunities, and tighter systems. And the people who do best won't be the ones who guessed the exact month the recession hits. They'll be the ones who built a life that can absorb impact without breaking.